Rebecca Schuman is a journalist and essayist writing on higher education for Slate and the Chronicle of Higher Ed. She also has contributed to The Atlantic and writes on Things German for the online magazine The All. She has a PhD in German from UC Irvine and taught for several years at the University of Missouri St. Louis and at Ohio State before becoming a full-time freelance journalist. And she has a brand spanking new book out, which I bet she won't object to my plugging. Schadenfreude, a love story from Flatiron Books, and I can't help but quote the extended subtitle, Me, the Germans, and 20 Years of Attempted Transformations, Unfortunate Miscommunications, and Humiliating Situations That Only They Have Words For. And then she's got another earlier book based on her dissertation on Kafka and Wittgenstein. Okay, but today we're going to talk about Trump, and I'm going to assume Trump is one of those cases where there is, as there sometimes can be, more or less of a consensus among those in higher ed. But Rebecca Schuman, as those of you who are fans of her columns will know, not everybody can formulate their opinions on him probably quite as acerbically or wittily as I suspect we're about to hear. So if you want to hear more about Rebecca and what she's up to, you can visit her website, nihilismforoptimists.com. I give you Rebecca Schuman.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really sorry that I can't be there in person. You may see video evidence of why in a minute if my daughter barges in here. I've tried to teach her how to do the little dance that the kid did for the BBC Dad, but I'm not sure whether she'll do it or not. Hopefully she will leave me alone, but there's no guarantee about that. So unfortunately, this is a very depressing and this is just a very depressing subject, so I'm not actually sure how funny I can be about the fate, not the fate, but the dangers of the Trump administration's effects on higher education. I'll try, but you know, these may be sort of what I call German-style jokes, where I'll just say like the bleakest thing in the world and then kind of grimace a little bit. And I haven't actually written that much about higher education and Trump, because it's not only is it so pressing, but it's actually very hard to express the severity of the effect the Trump government is having and will potentially have on the field of higher education and, of course, education in general, not to mention really the very act of thinking or being a thinking person itself. And the reason that it's hard, at least for me, to express the extent or severity of this effect is that right now we are understandably on sort of Trump horror overload. Anyone on social media or just reading the news, you see this constant onslaught all day, every day of like the next 10 or 15 pretty terrifying things that are happening. And we always think, okay, well, this is the worst case scenario come to life. And then something new and surreally terrible happens that have just, people haven't really been able to develop the language to express the severity without going into hyperbole, because this is sort of a new thing for everybody. I think that one of the interesting potential side effects of this administration will be kind of a new form of written and verbal expression where people are somehow able to express the abnormality of what's going on without sort of devolving into outrage porn and hyperbole. That has not happened yet. And so, I mean, understandably, because our language only has so much. As Wittgenstein said, the limits of our language are the limits of our world. And what's happening right now is like outside the limits of anybody's world. It should be, at any rate. And so it's unsurprising that we don't really have, or I don't have the language to express it that well. However, there's really nobody who should be able to express what's going on better than scholars and writers, because, I mean, I say we, even though I'm not really in the academy anymore, so I hope you'll forgive me this indulgence throughout the talk. We're the ones who have trained for years in the act of gathering and processing and synthesizing and sharing very difficult information. And it's almost like we've been training for our whole lives for something like this. We spend our research time, and in a lot of cases, our classroom time, trying to express the inexpressible, the incredible beauty of classic literature, or the importance of certain historical moments, or how everything fits together philosophically. All of that, the thing that makes you want to do what you do is an inexpressible thing. The thing that gives you the passion to spend your whole life getting a doctorate and then working on that research. And trying to express that inexpressible is kind of your life's work, I hope. I would imagine it certainly has been mine. And so it's almost like we have all been training for our whole lives for this moment. And now is the time for us to use this out in the field in possibly the most crucial moment ever in our lives. Unless some of you are my grandfather's age and lived through World War II, in which case you'd be 103, and congratulations on doing your doctorate at the age of 103. But anyone who's, my age, give or take 30 years on either end, this is the time. This is the only time in our lives that we'll ever be able to really use our strength as scholars to change the course of history. And that sounds, again, kind of hyperbolic because I don't really have any other way of expressing what's going on. Okay, so I'm going to do my best to express the severity of the situation by breaking it down into its attendant parts. And the first thing to understand, which isn't going to be news to anybody, is that an entity that I call the thinking, feeling person, which is sort of a stand-in for everybody in the university, from the first day freshman all the way up to the endowed full professor emeritus. The thinking, feeling person is the greatest threat to a repressive regime. Somebody who can feel and think through those feelings is the biggest threat that a repressive regime has. And as such, it is in that regime's interest to destroy any institutions that support, create, foster, or offer a home to the thinking, feeling person in any way. So, of course, the thinking, feeling person exists outside of the university. But in an ideal world, the university, the community college, any institution of learning should be the thinking, feeling person's strongest institutional ally, and a welcoming, accessible place where anyone who wants to think and feel can go to flourish. So it's in the Trump administration's best interest to make the American university as inhospitable to thinking and feeling as possible, and to make the very acts of thinking and feeling as unattractive as possible to the general American public, to marginalize people who think and feel for a living and who want other people to think and feel as much as possible. So, of course, to say that this era is like a ne plus ultra of anti-intellectualism is to do a great disservice to the very powerful anti-intellectualism of Nixon, Reagan, Bush too. I mean, we've had anti-intellectual presidential administrations before, and they've all done great harm, but it's not anything new. So Trump didn't invent this. He's not smart enough to, for one thing, and I don't think any of the people on his cabinet are either. But, and by not smart, I'm not being ableist, I mean willfully ignorant. So I should say that he's too willfully ignorant to create this environment of anti-intellectualism. He has benefited greatly from it, and he has brought it to a furious apex, and he has welcomed the greatest participants of it out of the shadows, many of whom are now on his cabinet. So, as we say, he didn't invent it, but his era might perfect it. And so here's how. And sort of a three-pronged attack. And the arenas of play in that attack are financial, legislative, and ideological. So I'd like to talk about the financial arena first, because in the era of the corporatized university, it's probably honestly the arena that can do the most damage, even though it's sort of the wonkiest to talk about. And so let's talk for a second about this sort of beloved free market that's now got the weight of a shriveled orange presidential thumb tipping the scales of it. So the financial attack on the fostering and support of the American thinking, feeling person is itself, again, multifaceted, and it's got a lot of moving parts. We've got the deregulation of the for-profit universities. We've got the reintroduction of predatory student lending and the systematic defunding of science, humanities, and arts research. And then, of course, the destruction of the educated populace from the ground up through so-called school choice at the K-12 level, and all of the other deleterious things that our Secretary of Education has planned in the elementary, middle, and high school milieu. So I want to talk about the for-profits first, because that's something I've done quite a bit of research on, mostly for pieces for The Atlantic, but also for Slate. So there was a lot of stuff to do on the morning after the election. There was some crying and rending of garments and like sitting around shell-shocked and being terrified. But what I did was that I looked at the stock price of, among other things, I looked at the stock price of the for-profit universities, because I knew what I was going to see. And I was right. They jumped. The second that guy got elected, the stock prices of DeVry and Phoenix and all the other so-called proprietary technical and vocational colleges were jubilant to celebrate the election of the mastermind behind Trump University. And then the stock just kept climbing as he appointed a Secretary of Education whose raison d'etre, like the rest of the cabinet, was to destroy the arm of government she'd been given to shepherd. So in another era, the longtime Secretary of Education under President Obama was Arne Duncan, and he certainly had his issues and he had his critics. He wasn't overwhelmingly popular, mostly because of the K-12 things that he supported. He was a vocal proponent of the Common Core standards. He was a little indiscriminate in his support of charter schools, and he was a little testing happy. However, when it came to the much needed regulation of the ballooning for-profit university sector, which drives about 35% of the student debt defaults in this country, Duncan was on point. And when they were doing a big push to pass some legislation that's now moot, they did a big press push, and I had the pleasure of talking with him on the phone for a while for an article I did for Slate about those regulations. And so one thing he told me about why it was so difficult, even in the Obama era, to pass regulation of this very powerful and very rich industry is that one of the things that they very smartly do with their money is they donate to the campaigns of Democrats and Republicans. And so what Arne Duncan said to me is that, look, these folks have friends on both sides of the aisle, very good, powerful friends on both sides of the aisle. So it's very difficult to enact legislation that regulates them as much as we should. But that certainly didn't stop them from trying. And even with all those friends in Congress, under President Obama and Secretary Duncan, the for-profits were, for example, at long last subject to the grand indignity of an enforced 90-10 rule. So the 90-10 rule, if you're not familiar, is a rule that says that for-profits can only receive 90% of their tuition revenue from federal grants and loans. And they were mad about that. Only 90%. And they were like, no, it's going to destroy us. And so they want that done away with. And then the other thing they want done away with that Secretary Duncan and President Obama managed to get through is something called the gainful employment rule. And basically, that's kind of a complicated series of different regulations. But one of the ways in which for-profits were made to prove they could result in gainful employment for their graduates was to make it a little bit easier to sue them for your tuition money back if they failed you. And one of the ways that they did that was that they stopped mandating, this is kind of boring legalese, but it's really important. Standard procedure for registration at most of these places is to sign a mandatory arbitration agreement. And you're probably given a lot of those to sign all the time, anytime you go to the doctors, anytime you enter into a contract. And if you ever have the opportunity, don't sign it. Because when you sign an arbitration agreement, you're signing away your right to sue independently. And instead you enter arbitration. Arbitration is done by for-profit companies that have big clients like the for-profits that keep hiring them again, and then little clients like you who they don't care about pleasing. So mandatory arbitration is weighted in favor of the big entities that don't want to be sued. And so the for-profits are appealing this right now with great fervor, and unsurprisingly, very unsurprisingly, they're being given a lot of leeway and extensions to file their appeals with the Department of Education right now. And coincidentally, at the same time, 2 new high-level hires have joined the Department of Education, and they're Robert Idle, who is an attorney for Bridgepoint, which is a for-profit conglomerate, and Taylor Hansen, who is an out-and-out lobbyist for the for-profit's major lobbying organization. So the Department of Education is now completely in the pockets of the for-profit university sector. So whatever feeble regulation was enacted during the Obama administration is going the way of the dodo immediately. And so the result of that is that a lot of very vulnerable students or potential students who could really benefit from low-cost alternatives such as community college, who also offer associate degrees in all of the fields that the for-profits say that they offer, they're going to once again be siphoned into these for-profits with predatory advertising. And these, every for-profit has one of the biggest offices that works for them is their Office of Financial Aid, that basically just walk people through the FAFSA and siphon away money from the federal government, and also banks, private banks, who do student loans. And as some of you probably know, because you have private student loans don't have the same protections as federal student loans do. And so they can charge you a lot of interest. There's no protection. If you go back to school, they won't freeze them for a while. So the student lending stuff is pretty grim under the Trump Department of Education. And it's actually about to get worse, because one of the first things that DeVos's education department did was make it easier to charge fees to people who default. Because as you well know, it's the best thing to do to somebody who doesn't have any money is to charge them more money. And so this isn't actually going to get any more money at first. I mean, it will when they collect and have the collection agencies come after these students. But it's mostly just going to get these folks who are already in debt and can't pay their loans further in debt. And I mean, I can't be the only person in this room or virtually in this room who has a lot of student loan debt. I do have a lot of student loan debt, and I've luckily always been able to pay it. But there have definitely been months where it was close, and it wasn't because I was like, well, I don't feel like doing this. And so I didn't need to be punished with a 16% surcharge on top of that. Like if I couldn't pay my loans, it was because I was in dire straits. And so, that's sort of the MO of the plutocracy in general. You charge as many fees as you can from people who can't afford to pay them. And then the ultra double platinum rich person's bank account has bonuses. So with all of these new student lending rules, many more of which are sure to follow, for many Americans who could benefit from college the most, a bachelor's or an associate's degree will soon be a financial gamble as unwise as a Trump-backed Atlantic City casino. And so then if you add to this the sort of final component of the financial issue, which is the well-documented defunding of the NEA, NEH, and scientific research on climate change and other environmental crises and other scientific things that don't go with the Trump agenda, what you have is this full-scale destabilization of the higher educational system from all sides, with a pointed aim of destruction of the educational aspirations of the most vulnerable populations. So the only people left to be able to get a college degree will be oligarchs or people who benefit from oligarchy and thus have no interest in making the oligarchy precarious in any way. And so then to add to that, you have the destabilization from below of making fewer students ready for college and wanting to go to college by basically completely obliterating the K-12 system. So you have to hand it to a bunch of people who are really ignorant. They have devised a fairly brilliant plan to use their beloved financial sector to eat away at the dream of successful education and therefore a thinking critical populace that is going to criticize them. Okay, so I wish I were done, but that was actually just the first arena. The second arena is the legislative arena. And so let's be fair and accurate. This was well underway before Trump was elected. It's not the brainchild of his administration, but it's definitely the recipient of new benevolence from up top. So everyone in this room knows about the ongoing drive to destroy the institution of tenure. And you're probably familiar with the case of the University of Wisconsin. So what happened there is that Wisconsin is a special case where state university tenure was actually enshrined in the state constitution as part of the vaunted Wisconsin idea of higher education. And, oh good, there's a thunderstorm in St. Louis to add, I feel like the count, because I'm not happy, this is horrible. So to add to the ominousness, there's a horrible thunderstorm outside my window right now. So Scott Walker, the governor of Wisconsin, did not like the idea of professor tenure being in the Constitution, so he removed it in a budget. He just sort of had it written into a new budget that it was gone, and also happened to weaken shared governance. There's just a bunch of stuff that was enshrined in the Constitution that was designed to protect scholars in Wisconsin, but actually ended up working in their disfavor because the Constitution could be changed if enough people in the legislature wanted it to be, and they did. So basically what happened is that now the regents of the University of Wisconsin can just end any program they want to if they've decided to. They can say that they want to take this school in a different direction. Tenure doesn't really protect anybody there because if you get along the wrong side of the regents, most of whom are appointed by Scott Walker, you can just have your program ended. And so there's been sort of a mass exodus from the University of Wisconsin. It used to be in the top 3, I think, in public universities in the country. Now it's not, because a lot of their top researchers freaked out and took better offers at elite private universities. So that's the sort of thing that's being done to tenure and copied around. In states where tenure isn't enshrined, it's much easier to take it away. And unfortunately, the professoriate has benefited from, not benefited, I'm being sarcastic, has suffered from decades of public misunderstanding of tenure. Like if you walk up to some intelligent person you know who isn't in academia and ask them how tenure works, they will give you some of the funniest responses that you have ever seen. Like just an example of what, if you watch TV, if there's ever a professor on TV, the explanation of how they got tenure or how they might get tenure is absurd. People like run for it like office, or your dean puts you up for it without you knowing. It's like a surprise. People think that it's like some sort of magic thing that you get and then it means that you never have to work again. And you know, I've spent 4 years writing for Slate trying to explain how tenure works and what it is, and I'm preaching to the choir. Like the people who know what it is say, yes, okay, Rebecca, thank you. And then the people who don't, they don't even read what I write, and then they just go, oh, you're lazy professors. And I'm like, not me, I don't have tenure. I'm trying to protect something I will never have. So the sort of professoriate has terrible branding to begin with, and that allows predatory legislators like Mark Chelgren from Iowa to introduce these ridiculous bills that say like the students should be able to vote professors out they don't like, or any professor who wants to work at the University of Iowa should have to take an ideological purity test, and they should have to hire 50% Republicans and 50% Democrats. Like none of those bills made it to the legislature, to voting. But like, how would you even do that? How would you, I was trying to think of how you would conduct a proper ideological purity test for potential professors, and you'd have to like clockwork orange them. You'd have to like pry their eyes open and then put a bunch of images in front of them and like test how they reacted with their heart, like Ronald Reagan, Karl Marx, a latte, like, like I don't know what you would do. A Volvo. I don't. I have no idea how that would work. But these are the kinds of things that the anti-intellectual apex, the environment that like refers to anybody who likes to read a book as like a snowflake. We'll get to that a little bit in the ideological wing in a second. There's a lot of legislation that is just ridiculously anti-university by people like Mark Chelgren, who got their degree from a Sizzler. Like literally, he took a 2-week management course at Sizzler, and that's his experience with the liberal professoriate. And so most of these don't pass because they're just too ridiculous, but eventually some will. And so, that's the legislative attack on the thinking, feeling person in America. So now this brings me to the third one. And the third one, just in time for some thunder, the third one is the one that's gotten the most press. And in a way, it's the least important, even though it's the most important because it hurts the individuals that it hurts the most. The financial stuff, the reason I spent so much time on the financial stuff is because that's what's going to hurt the most people. But the most visible pain is the ideological pain that's being inflicted, and it definitely deserves our attention too. I think I'm actually just stalling talking about it because it's so distressing. So most of you know that in the month, just the month alone after the November election, there was like almost 1,000 bias incidents. No, over 1,000 bias incidents in the United States, just the ones reported to the Southern Poverty Law Center. So of these bias incidents, there were 57 just in 1 month. Like since then, there's been way more. But just in the 1 month after the election, there were 57 documented instances of white nationalist flyering of institutions, like putting flyers up about, I don't know, white supremacy, white pride, let your white flag fly, I don't know. But 74% of that was done on college campuses. Then there was the swastika graffiti. Just a few of the places where it was reported to the Southern Poverty Law Center were Nassau County, Hebrew Union, Northwestern, New Mexico, William and Mary, Swarthmore, Stanford, and that's just a month. There have been Muslim and Black students terrorized and assaulted at Nazareth College and the University of Washington, Cal Berkeley. The amount of bias, intimidation, and violence on the college campuses since this election, whether it be of the micro or macro aggressive variety, has been very dispiriting. And meanwhile, in that environment, this 22-year-old conservative activist who himself has never been to college, named Charlie Kirk, decided to launch a website called Professor Watchlist. I don't know if any of you are on it. I know people who are on it who see it as a point of pride. But it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a website that lists the names, office locations, photos, sometimes teaching schedule, and other identifying information of faculty members around the country who advance a radical agenda in lecture halls. So most of these are culled from conservative sites like Campus Reform, but some are crowdsourced from reader submission. So some faculty that I know have chosen to resist this by submitting their own names, and others are in fear for their safety and the integrity of their courses. And this is not unfounded. Inspired by movements like Charlie Kirk's, shortly after the election, a professor at Orange Coast College in California was filmed without her consent or knowledge while answering a question from a distressed student who was distressed about Trump. So her quotes were taken out of context, and this conservative furor ensued, and it sort of allowed sites like Charlie Kirk's to justify their existence. I mean, I don't even need to talk about the bigot tours that have gone on, like Milo Yiannopoulos or Charles Murray, who are, being paid money and given a platform, a university-sanctioned platform to speak, and then get really surprised when people get angry and there's an uprising. Like, oh, I can't believe how mad people, all I was going to do was come and talk about how stupid women are and how inferior minorities are. That's my free speech. And so that sort of it reorients the free speech conversation to be something that it's not, and it confuses paid speech with free speech. Sorry about that. BBC Dad style, I just got a text from my husband saying, "Kid's fine. Thanks for letting me know." Okay, so anytime anybody dares to say, "Hey, we don't want our university money paying for these bigots to come and spout their bigotry," people go, "Oh, you're a snowflake and you hate free speech." And so it reorients this conversation so that somehow the fascists are the free speech pioneers, and the people who actually care about freedom of thought are the liberal thought police. And, in this spirit, the Secretary of Education got in front of CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee, like, conservative Woodstock, and essentially accused every professor in the United States of being a Stalinist propagandist. So listen, the job of university professor has never been particularly well understood by the general public, but it's not going to get any better now. So the reason it's not going to get any better is because this is a generalization, of course, and so take it with a grain of salt, but many Americans have this weird thing, right, where they think that if you're a professor, they think you think you're smarter than they are. I don't know if this has happened to you, but when I was a professor, people would ask me what I did. And especially as a woman, it would kind of, sometimes I would just say I was a teacher. Because if I said I was a professor, oftentimes people would go, "Ooh, you think you're so smart." And that's sort of, it's anti-American to think you're smarter than everybody else, or that you're better than somebody because you're smarter than they are. And of course, I've never thought I was smarter than anybody, or if I did, it certainly wasn't in a malevolent way. And I certainly don't think I'm better than anybody, but so he's not the ne plus ultra of an anti-intellectualism, but Trump and sort of Trump's personality is the ne plus ultra of the person who, when you try to use any sort of hard word at him, just goes, "Ooh," and then trips you, right? So that's sort of what you're dealing with, is and people who have, for one reason or another, actually been failed by the education system, and then choose to cling, as President Obama would say, to their ignorance, to sort of wear it as the sign and seal of their intoxicating new power, or power that they feel exists. They're all just pawns in a plutocracy, but don't tell them. And on the business end of this power, the plutocrat's power, is anyone who threatens the New World Order. And that includes, first and foremost, anyone with the power and the platform to think critically and to share those critical thoughts. So if I were really, if I were really nihilistic instead of an optimistic nihilist, I'd just end the talk and we would all just have a good cry. And then, spend 3 hours scrolling through outrage porn on our Facebook feeds. But what I really wanted to do today was to share some ideas of what all of us can do to help. And then I'd like to open up the floor, and maybe we can all work on this a little bit together, and everybody can leave today with a takeaway of some concrete steps that you personally can take today to stop this from happening to the worst extent that it can. So in the financial sector, I will readily admit that unless we're wealthy, we can't really do much to influence the free market system that is freely rigged against us. Universities can hit up their big donors for more scholarship aid so that they're not beholden to federal scholarship aid or the big banks. But that's, then suddenly there's more fundraising and less of everything else. There are nonprofits that can spring up to help students with financial empowerment, but that has to come from benevolent rich people to counteract the malevolent rich people. So I don't know, maybe Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg or one of these, I'm going to give all my money away, do-gooder billionaires will do something like that. But that's sort of the best that we can hope for now. The legislative thing, I can't be the only person who sees a constant stream of my Facebook friends being like, "I'm calling my congressman all day." And that's great. You're doing the Lord's work. I'm really proud of you. My congressman is Roy Blunt, and he doesn't give a good goddamn about anything. He would like me to die. So I don't even try with him because he's just such a bastard. What I do is vote in my local elections. And students, especially undergraduate students who are eligible to vote in the local elections where they go to school or eligible to vote in their local elections back home. Local elections don't get much national TV time. They don't get much play. And so people think they aren't important, where in actuality, they are the most important. The biggest example of that I can give is my own city in St. Louis. Here in St. Louis, we just had our mayoral primary. So St. Louis is a big metro area of about 3 million people, but only about 350,000 of those people actually live within the limits of St. Louis City, like me. And of the people who live here with me in St. Louis City, a plurality of those people are African American and Black, and a smaller amount are white, and then a teeny tiny minority are any other minority. So we are, in effect, a majority Black city. We have never had a Black mayor. We have never had a Black mayor. And so we had a lot of really interesting mayoral candidates this time. We always have a Democratic mayor, but we never have a Black mayor. And this year we had an extremely electric, very dynamic, incredibly wonderful candidate by the name of Tashara Jones. And she really ran this dark horse campaign. She had very little money until the very end, when she made the national news for refusing to sit down with the editorial board of our extremely racist daily newspaper. And she had a late push to win, but of the 150,000 registered voters in my city, which is pathetic, I think like 40,000 people actually came out to vote. And Tashara lost her primary by 888 votes, which is a city block, even in an unpopulated city like mine. And if more people, more young people especially, had recognized the incredible importance of having local leadership that actually reflects the needs of the local population, then I think she would have won in a landslide. And she could have done really amazing things for this city. So at the legislative end, calling your congressman is great. Running for local office is better. Voting in local office is the best of all. But all of that is fine and good. Here's where we really can help: the ideological battle. We are the ones who know how to disseminate ideas the best. That's our job. That is what we have trained for, as I said, for our entire adult lives. The ideological battle is ours to lose, because we are, nominally at least, better at rhetoric than our enemies. We are the only ones who technically know what rhetoric is, so we should destroy that. We've gone to all these years of school, and we have spent this whole time learning to synthesize information into good arguments. The seminars, the dissertations, the papers, the classes, the conference papers, those are dry runs, and now it's showtime. So the first thing that we can do is take our show on the road and do outreach into communities, especially into schools. I know of several programs here in St. Louis where professors go to elementary school classrooms and do an elementary version of what their shtick is for the class. So obviously you have to prepare a special, different kind of activity, but if you have kids and know how to talk to kids, it's actually not that hard to do. Another thing that you can do that's very effective with kids is to bring some of your best students with you who come from the same background as the kids did, who went to that school, who went to a school like it. And you bring those sophomores or juniors, high achieving students with you, and you talk to kids about how cool it is to be in college. Some of them may never have seen anybody in college before. And so most elementary classrooms would be delighted to have you. There are programs that you can work through. You can also work independently. If you have a kid who goes to school, that's where you start. So whatever Betsy DeVos is doing to ruin our young people's schools, we can unruin that ourselves by stepping into those schools and talking about how awesome it is to study things that we like to study, and to actually, and they'll be like, you do homework for a living? And you'll be like, yes, and I love it. With the students that you have now, it's really important to keep dialogue open, try not to fly off the handle if they've been watching the Breitbart or whatever and are trying to unnerve you and definitely seem like they're trying to film you. Treat every single off-topic conversation in your class as a teachable moment. For example, you can unpack terms like trigger and safe place and snowflake and let them understand that everything is way more complicated than I'm a liberal here to indoctrinate you. This is a fun one that I thought of, which is to set up a summit on or off campus with people who don't like professors and have basically like a professor versus anti-professor civil, respectful and civil summit debate kind of thing with an audience. And you can even charge admission and have that money go to charitable educational causes or your on-campus food pantry or something like that. Where I got that idea is, I don't know if any of you have went to or undergrad at Ohio State or know anything about Ohio State, but I taught at Ohio State for 2 years, and in the middle of campus, there's this ginormous grass oval called the Oval. And in the warm months, all the students just go out there in their bikinis. But in the cooler months, there's this dude, this one guy who's not affiliated with the university in any way. He's just read like a lot of Ayn Rand, like a lot of Ayn Rand. And he just gets up on a literal soapbox or some sort of box and just talks for like 8 hours a day about the free market. And I saw students there pay more rapt attention to him than they did to their world-class Nobel laureate professors. And it depressed the hell out of me. And it also depressed the hell out of me that those professors were just ignoring that guy instead of inviting him in and saying, okay, if you think you're so good for a bunch of impressionable 19-year-olds, why don't you come in and talk to some sociologists and have a summit? So if you have one of those on your campus and they're not like a total bigot who's going to get a violent protest, invite them in or set up a summit in a safe space off campus, a neutral space, I mean. If you are a higher profile expert of some sort and you get asked to do TV, radio, etc., it's always important to humanize yourself as much as possible and emphasize the shared experiences you have with everybody instead of the differences. The last thing that I want to talk about, and if you were students, you'd all be packing up and getting ready to go now, is that nowadays, the most important thing that you can do at the professorial or graduate student level is to have outspoken support for every single marginalized community on campus, from communities of color to women to intersectional communities, to the LGBT community, to the staff and the adjunct workers. And especially the sort of adjunct versus regular professor divide. Every faculty member in a department probably agrees on like 96% of the important things in the world. And yet at every faculty meeting in this country right now, there are people coming to blows over differences that are probably really petty. And so for the next, I hope it's not 4 years, but for the next however long we have to deal with this, I would suggest two things. Those at the top of the professorial hierarchy, and I know that you don't have that much power anyway, but whatever small amount of power that you have, use it to speak for the people who can't speak because their jobs are precarious or because they feel scared. And for everybody, no matter how valid your criticism of somebody else is, try to remember that 96% right now for at least the next, God, I hope it's not 3 years and 10 months. Okay, so now I want to just open it up and we can talk a little bit, take some questions. I'm sorry this wasn't that funny, but it's not, it's pretty hard to be funny about this. I also think that it's really super. Thank you for having me.